Hello, hello. This is Derek from One River Tea. Welcome back to another episode of Tea Soup, a podcast all about tea culture, life in modern China, and Chinese tea. I'm your host, Derek Poskin. I've been living in China since 2016, and I've been drinking, buying, and selling Chinese tea for the past decade. So, pop on that kettle, heat up your teaware, and let's get this session started. Alright, so this is the third episode in the green tea kick I'm doing in honor of the Ming-Qian tea season starting off. And for those of you who caught the white tea types episode, I believe that was episode 8, you'll know that Qingming is one of the 24 Chinese solar terms and usually takes place right around April 5th. Now, Qingmingjie in Chinese means the tomb sweeping day, and usually it's kind of like a memorial day for China where you go to the ancestors, the tombs of your ancestors, you put flowers on the graves, you clean up the areas around their tombs and whatnot. And so the translation is usually called Tomb Sweeping Day, but for the Chinese tea world, it really coincides with the best green teas are picked before this date, April 5th. And as I mentioned in episode 8, tea farmers of the past millennia have stitched this harvest time into the ancient agricultural calendar, which started around, I believe it was multiple hundreds of years BC. We saw this in the Han Dynasty already taking effect, these equinoxes. Actually, today is the spring equinox. So this is yet another solar term. And so Qingmingjie is just 2 weeks away because there are 2 weeks you get a new solar term, and there are 24 solar terms in the year. Anyways, I give the whole explanation in episode 8. So check that out if you're interested. To get back to this tea term, a lot of you have heard before, Ming-Qian. Ming-Qian tea, sometimes we see pre-Qingming, sometimes we see pre-tomb sweeping. Again, Qingmingjie is translated as tomb sweeping day, sometimes translated as pure brightness festival, but we know it's the solar term called Qingming, which is just pure brightness. And so Ming-Qian is just an often transliterated term. It's not translated. Ming is the reference to the Qingming festival, or the Qingming solar term, and then Qian in Chinese means before. So it literally just translates this Ming-Qian means bright before, but it means before the solar term pure brightness. And now, real quick, a small linguistic side note here. The Chinese language has this lovely proclivity to simplify and shorten these set phrases into just 2 characters. And so what we should probably see, Qingming Qian, gets shortened to Ming Qian. And so they just cut off that Qing. They don't need it. Everyone knows what you're talking about. And we'll see this commonly with like universities and stuff like that. Like, for instance, the Beijing University, Beijing Dashui, just gets shortened to Beida, which just means North Big. But everyone knows you mean Beijing Dashui, Beijing University when you say the North Big. Oh yeah, I was up at North Big, and everyone's like, oh yeah, Beijing University. But to somebody who's kind of new to the language, it sometimes takes a while to realize, oh, that's a shortened phrase. That's a shortened phrase. And so Ming-Qian is just another example of one of these shortened phrases that's worked its way into the colloquial language. Anyways, when doing a podcast all about Chinese tea and life in modern China, the Chinese language plays a huge role in it. And so when I come across these phrases, I'll try and explain them the best I can. Last 2 episodes, I talked about the Jiangsu green tea Bilotun. And in that, I had a bit of a tangent on how do we translate Bilotun? Should we translate? Do we need to translate? Does everyone know it? And in my opinion, Ming-Qian is another one that just doesn't need to get translated. It's part of the language now. Everyone knows what it means. So, in the first episode about Bilotun, I gave the brief history of its origin, its myths. In the second episode, I talked about my trip to the production region. And now in this episode, I'll repeat that formula, but with a different type of green tea, one that a lot of you are really excited about, I'm sure. This is Longjing, or Dragonwell. Now, Dragonwell is probably one of the most famous types of green tea in China and abroad. And while there are other types of Chinese green teas that might appear more famous in the West, for instance, gunpowder green tea or jasmine green tea, stuff in this vein, in domestic popularity, these teas come nowhere near the fame and honor awarded Dragonwell green tea from West Lake, Hangzhou. Everyone knows about it. Everyone considers it probably one of the top Chinese teas. The most famous, the most ancient, the most iconic Chinese tea in a lot of people's minds here is Dragonwell green tea. And as a result, to give a little bit of my perspective on this, I have not sourced Dragonwell green tea. Last year was the first year I sourced Dragonwell green tea, and I'll tell you about why. Because I've been to Dragonwell a few times in the village. It's beautiful, it's fun, I enjoy it, but it's a wild, wild world out there because there's such a small production region, an actual production region, and such a huge demand. I read one statistic that said about 10% of the Dragonwell on the market actually comes from the West Lake area, which, I've heard before maybe 20% does, but this number is just incredibly small because there's just not enough fields in that area to meet the demand. The demand in China is massive. The demand abroad is also equally large, not equally large, but very, very large. And I have a story of when I first went to the Dragonwell village back in 2017, and I was there right around the Qingmingjie festival. So right around April 4th, April 5th, and I saw all of these how would I say it? I want to say Shunfeng trucks, these Kuaidi trucks, but that's all Chinese. These post office trucks, these people like courier trucks that do like package delivery and stuff. They were pulling up into the Dragonwell village outside of people's homes that are making Dragonwell tea. They open up the back and it's full of freshly picked tea, probably from another region. I mean, why are they driving it on highways to get here? A lot of the other pickers are just coming in from the mountains, walking in from the mountains with their picks and everything. And so usually you don't need trucks to get you your tea. Seeing that, I'm like, okay, that's probably extra regional tea. That's probably tea that's picked outside of the West Lake area, brought in here, and then they're making it here to make it look like it's made here in the village. I remember hearing something like a lot of the olive oil, it gets actually grown in another country like Central America. Then the olives are shipped to Italy, and then they press it into olive oil, and that way they can say it was made in Italy. Just one of the small problems of living in this very, very modern, globalized world that we're living in right now. And so there I was in the Dragonwell village at Qingmingjie Festival, watching people make Dragonwell in a wok by hand, and seeing these trucks pull up where they're just dumping leaves that were picked from who knows where into the pile. And I'm thinking, even here, in person, at this time, I'm not certain I can buy authentic Dragonwell green tea. And so ever since then, I was very disheartened about finding the genuine product, especially from abroad, especially from a distance and stuff like that, without having the connection, without seeing the whole process from the bush to the wok, to the cup. And so I've kind of written it off. But last year I started trying to source it because what I really want to do is I want to explore this extra regional Dragonwell green tea. So we'll see if this year, if I go to the West Lake area, if I can find somebody I trust. If not, I'm going to go right to Shaoxing, right to Xincheng, where they make a lot of this knockoff Dragonwell, and kind of show the whole process of, where they're making it outside of Hangzhou, and then just be really transparent about buying that and selling that. That said, in addition to the difficulty to source genuine Dragonwell green tea, unless you've been doing it for a long time and you have connections that you really trust and know, you have that guanxi, that connection and relationship. Another problem with sourcing authentic Dragonwell green tea are the prices. It's 2 or 3 times more expensive than almost any other green tea I'm sourcing at the moment, just because there's so much demand for it, so much popularity in China. And especially the Mingqian teas, like Dragonwell is particularly famous for its Mingqian stuff. You look at like Luan Guapian, they don't have Mingqian Luan Guapian. It's just a later harvest. And so teas like that, while they can be expensive, they're nowhere near the $2,000, $3,000 a pound level that Dragonwell can be, especially good Dragonwell from the right region, Mingqian style. And so to hop right in there, let me explain the shape, smell, and taste of this very iconic tea. Dragonwell green tea is a flat green tea, whose shape is created by pressing the drying leaves by hand against the side of a hot wok. And these are woks exclusively used for making tea. There's never any oil in there. There's never any food residue. And so get all these ideas out of your mind. I have to make this clarification, because I was talking in Bilochun where they're making tea in these woks, and I had a few people asking if it was like separate from the kitchen wok, and yes, it's completely separate. It's a different facility. The tea woks, they're never used for cooking. They're just used for making tea. Maybe in ancient times it was different, but right now in most of the houses I see, completely separate buildings as well. So when you see things that say, oh, this was fried in a wok, this tea was cooked in a wok, what you really need to think is it's a dry wok with no oil, no water, just the tea leaves, and it's either heated by wood, and usually if it's heated by wood, there's a partitioned wall where on one side they're adding firewood to the wok, and that's keeping all the smoke in that area. And then there's the other side where they're actually making the tea, and then you just get the steam of the tea. You don't get any of the wood smoke. Or it's made in an electric wok, and this is, or gas-powered wok, and these are a lot easier to control. And so a lot of the modern teas, the mass-produced teas, are made in electric woks, or they're even made in specialized machines. Now, the size of these woks, they're essentially the size of a huge satellite dish, and they're usually about waist high, and so the tea maker is literally bending over this hot wok. As I mentioned, for Dragonwell, or for Bilochun, it takes about 45 minutes to make like 250 grams of tea in the wok from start to finish. I'm not sure exactly Dragonwell. I'll check that out next week because I'm going to Hangzhou, and I'll give you an update on exactly the processing for Dragonwell green tea next week. But to get back to the tea itself, Dragonwell for me always has a nice toasty aroma to it. It's often described as a chestnut aroma, and so think of like chestnuts, roasted chestnuts over an open fire, something like that. But it also has this nice, savory, rich green bean aroma, which for me is very, very particular, and I can identify it almost all the time, and a lot of green teas just do not have this flavor. Now, the taste should be very true to the fragrance here. It provides a really nice, thick mouthfeel with a good dose of umami and a lot of vegetal notes like spring grasses and even like something floral like bee pollen or something like that. While it can be brewed in a teapot or in a brew cup, a gaiwan, it's usually often drunk just in a glass without a filter. And this is known as in the West as grandpa style. In most of China, it's known as the Dawan style, the big bowl style. Though in Zhejiang and Jiangsu, it's just the way you drink green teas. And the methodology here is simplicity itself. You take like an 8-ounce glass of water, heat it up with hot water, rinse it, and then add about 2 or 3 grams of the dry tea to it, and then fill it with 80-degree water. You'll want to let it brew for about a minute or 2 minutes, during which time most of the leaves open up and kind of sink to the bottom. And then you can just drink straight from the glass. If there are any leaves that are still floating, you can strain them with your teeth. You can even chew them, because if you're drinking really nice green tea, the tea leaves themselves are actually pretty tasty, especially once they brew out. And then what you want to do is you want to drink it down about 3/4 of the way, and then you add a little more hot water. And you can do this about 3 or 4 times before the brew starts getting really light. And if you ever go to a tea house, if you're ever drinking green tea in Hangzhou and Zhejiang and Jiangsu, this is how they'll serve you tea, and this is how you'll test the tea. There's no better way to test the tea to a lot of these tea makers, to these tea sellers, to these people in the tea houses. So in keeping with the spirit of the podcast, let's trace the origins of Dragonwell green tea as far back as we can and look and see if we can see any origin myths similar to that we saw with Bilochun or fruiting white tea. And one thing I came across when I was doing this research is that a lot of the origin myths take their place in the Jin Dynasty, in the Song Dynasty. A lot of the really interesting stories about Dragonwell green tea are deeply rooted in a historical context. And so this is very different from what we saw in Bilochun, where we see these ancient myths of dragons and stuff like that, or the other myths that we saw with the fruiting white tea, with like the prehistory way back in antiquity. And so we don't get a lot of these aqueous prehistoric myths. Instead, what we do see are justifications for why this tea is so famous and why this tea is so popular. And so we see actual living emperors coming to Hangzhou and talking about the teas and stuff like that. And so my opinion of why this is happening is because Dragonwell already has a deeply rooted level of notoriety. It's a famous tea, and it doesn't need to be sanctified with ancient myths. It doesn't have to find its its place in the modern tea world by justifying its ancient origins. It's always been one of the best green teas in China. And so instead of having an origin myth that says, oh, this is the original tea that was from this region, blah, 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 we just see a lot of myths saying, like, this is why it's so popular. This is why it's so good. And another really nice thing is there is a lot of historical evidence for this tea. And so I was able to go back pretty reasonably, back to where it all starts, Lu Yu's Classic of Tea. And he mentions that there is a tea in Tiantai, which is modern-day Hangzhou. And he says that two temples produce this tea. There's the Tianzhu Temple and the Lingyun Temple. And from those two temples, you get this Tiantai tea, which is in the West Lake area and very popular. And so we first see it noted in the Tang as one of the good teas out of this area. And then we also see it grow in popularity in the Song Dynasty, primarily because in the southern Song, the capital of China moved from Xi'an in the north down to Hangzhou. And this is because there was the Mongols invading from the north. Think of the Great Wall. Think the northern part of China fell and the court fled south. And you can just imagine once the court was set up and fully ensconced just a few kilometers away from the West Lake area in Hangzhou, the tea from that region got a huge subsidies, got huge amounts of attention and popularity, and so it just took off in the Song Dynasty and the Southern Song. And just before that, in the Northern Song, we get the poet Su Shi, who's one of my favorite poets in the Song Dynasty. And he writes that the teas in this area were planted in the Tianhu Temple that were originally brought from the Tiantai Mountains by this traveling Buddhist poet called Xie Lingyun back in the Jin Dynasty. This is the northern southern dynasty around 300 to 500 AD. And this all tracks perfectly with what we discovered in the first episode of the podcast, the history of tea in China. It's usually the Buddhists who are bringing all of these teas throughout China. They're traveling from monastery to monastery. Tea is becoming their beverage of choice, and they're planting it everywhere they go. Another really awesome part about this story is that it talks about the Tiantai Mountain. The Tiantai Mountain, this is the Guoqing Temple, which I think is one of the oldest, most beautiful temples I've been to in China. And it got really popular around the Jin Dynasty, around 400, 500 AD. And this is when Buddhism started really taking effect in China. In this mountain range, in the Tiantai mountain range, you get a lot of these Taoist hermits, these Taoist mystics and stuff like that. People practicing all of these strange religions, these folk religions. And then in this swirl, you get this rigid structure of Buddhism. And with that melding of it, you get these really interesting ideas of Buddhism mixed with Taoism. You get the Zen Buddhist schools that come out of here. And this was actually from Tiantai. This was taken to Japan, the Buddhism from here. And this is called in Japanese the Tiantai sect. And so that's just a literal transliteration of Tiantai from Chinese, meaning heaven's stage or heaven's platform. And so it's really cool. You see this really vortex of philosophical and religious and cultural power in the Jin Dynasty, which is the Tiantai Mountains. And from here, this is where the tea bushes go over to Hangzhou, over to the West Lake area. And these are the original tea plants that came from this mountain range into Zhejiang, into northern Zhejiang, into Hangzhou. And one really interesting thing about this is I was hiking through these mountains just a few months ago. Back in February of 2023, I was looking for that fake Dragonwell down in Xinchang, and I realized Tiantai was just, a short train ride away because they just connected the high-speed rail. And so from Xinchang, which is southern Shaoxing, where they're growing all this knockoff Dragonwell, it was about a 15-minute train ride to get to Tiantai. And I've been wanting to go to Tiantai Mountain ever since I got to China. There's this really, really beautiful hermit poet called Han Shan, or Cold Mountain, and he lived around the Guoqing Temple area. And I eventually found his hermit's cave with the help of Bill Porter, who's a fantastic translator of Chinese poetry and everything. And so I found the hermit's cave of Han Shan of Cold Mountain. I found the temple that was the nunnery, essentially, that was built up around where he used to live. And I also went to Guoqing Temple. During this time, I was hiking through the mountains, and I kept coming across huge, like the size of my wrist as their trunk, tea trees in the wilds. And I came across so many of them. I was like, wow, there's so many things here. And for me, what I was doing is I was trying to look at the connection between Buddhism and tea and stuff like that. And I certainly found it in this mountain range. And so it totally makes sense that tea was grown all throughout this mountain range and then carried from here on to the other temples and other areas. I did take a lot of videos during that trip, and eventually I will make a video, I promise. And I'll put it up on the One River Tea YouTube channel. So go over there, check it out, subscribe, and I'm sure I'll post it at some point. My trip both to Hanshan's Hermit's Cave and then also my discovery of the kind of knockoff Dragonwell in the region. So from here we have reliable evidence that tea came to the Hangzhou region from the Tiantai mountain range in the Jin Dynasty. By this, we even have the name for the poet monk that transferred it. His name was the Xie Lingyun. And then here we see it grow in popularity in the Tang Dynasty. We see Lu Yu mention it in his tea classic, but then it's just called the Qiantang tea, which is just the old name for the Hangzhou area. It wasn't until the Song Dynasty that we get the fresh brand name of the Longjing or Dragonwell tea. And if you remember from the first episode of this podcast, we talk about how the Song Dynasty, we saw the creation of these name brand teas, and we also saw the creation of fake teas. Teas with the brand name that were grown in the wrong region that are just selling for the same amount. However, at this time, they're still making it like matcha. They're still grinding it up, pressing it into tea cakes. There's no kill green phase happening. But this is when we do get the name Longjing. And so let me tell you about the name Longjing and where it came from. So Longjing, Dragonwell, is literally a direct translation. There is a dragon well. There's a well in the Dragonwell village in the West Lake area, carved in the shape of dragons. And supposedly during the droughts and everything, all the other wells, all the other springs and everything would dry up except for this well. And so the ancient name for this well is the Longjing, which is the dragon deep water well, which is really fascinating because in time it was shortened to Longjing. So they didn't need that Hong. They don't need the Longjing. They just shortened it down to Longjing. So remember earlier I talked about how the Chinese language loves to shorten things into two-character phrases. Well, this is one instance where in time it just got simplified. Now we see the popularity of this dragon well and the tea that was grown in the region. It really comes together with some of the Northern Song Dynasty poets, particularly Su Dongpo. He was enamored with the environment. He'd always come here and drink tea and stay in the temple and everything. And he wrote this beautiful plaque in his calligraphic style, and it reads Lao Longjing, Old Dragon Well. And this plaque is still preserved at the base of Shifeng, which is also known as Lion's Peak. And so you see from here, we get that seed of the name, and in a very historical way, because Su Dongpo in his poetry mentions Dragonwell, mentions tea, and so it's a very logical step here. In the Yuan dynasty, we get our first mention of pan-frying tea. We get a little bit of smoke and fire and few mentions of the processing techniques. But it's not until the Ming dynasty, when Zhu Yuanzhong has that declaration that all tribute tea should be loose-leaf tea, that we see the widespread dissemination of this tea to commoners, to the literati, to people all around China. And then towards the end of the Ming, we see the tea growing area in this region kind of break the bounds and kind of merge together. So where before we had tea from the Lingyun temple, we had tea from the Dragonwell village, we had all of these particular mountain peaks growing tea, now the West Lake area is kind of opening up for cultivation. With the capital of China being Hangzhou at this time, this tea steadily grows in popularity until there's the Qianlong emperor in the Qing dynasty, and he's a rather flamboyant emperor who does a ton of traveling throughout China. He collects a lot of art and artifacts. He's another one of the really famous Qing dynasty emperors, and he visited the West Lake area about 6 times, so it said. And he went to see the Longjing, the Dragonwell picking, 4 times in person. And he was so taken by these teas, he even wrote a few poems about the Longjing tea and finally declared 18 of the tea bushes at the bottom of Hugong Temple, at the bottom of the Shifeng Peak, as imperial tea bushes. And then towards the end of the Qing Dynasty, we see several lists compiling the highest quality of Chinese teas in the nation. And Dragonwell not only finds its way into almost all of these lists, but is usually awarded the #1 spot. Other honorable mentions are the Wui Oolongs. There's the Luan Guapian, which is really famous in the end of the Qing Dynasty area. So this brings us up to the Qing Dynasty, but we still have that Republican period, we have the PRC, and we have the modern times where a lot of changes are happening to this Westlake area. And I'll talk about this a little later because this is really important for how we're splitting up the regions, what areas, what peaks make the best tea. And we'll kind of talk about the whole 5 different areas within the Westlake and then the areas outside of there. But what I want to do right now is take another pass at the mythology, because now that we have a kind of historical background, historical footing, I can kind of tell you the story about the Qianlong Emperor and his 18 imperial tea trees. So the story goes like this. The Qianlong Emperor really loved Dragonwell, really loved the Westlake area. As I mentioned, he's been there 6 times, seen the processing 4 times, and he liked to write poetry about it. And so the story takes place in the 1700s, and it goes like this. One day while Qianlong was admiring the tea gardens in Hangzhou's Westlake area, he was watching the tea pickers pick the teas. He was writing poetry about the beautiful scenery, and he tried his hand at picking the teas himself. And then at this time, one of his aides came coming up to tell him that the Empress Dowager is sick with a bad cough and she requests his immediate return. And so without hesitation, he takes his handful of leaves that he just picked, and to preserve them on the trip back to the court, he puts them in his book of poems and then closes the book together, safely pressing the tea leaves in between the pages. And then he returns to the palace to see what's going on with the Empress. And yes, she's sick in bed with a bad cough. But as soon as he enters the chambers, she smells this incredible fragrance. And she says, "What is that smell that you're bringing into my chambers?" And the Qianlong kind of realizes, oh, it must be the green tea that I just picked, that I pressed in the book. And so he takes out his book of poems, he opens it up to look at the tea, and he finds that the leaves have all been pressed and dried flat, like little flags on flagpoles. And the Empress says, "It smells so good, brew me a cup of this with some hot water." And so he does this, and upon drinking the concoction, she's completely cured. It's a panacea, right? And so at once the Qianlong Emperor declares the 18 tea bushes in front of the Hugong Temple at the base of Lion's Peak, from which he picked these tea leaves. These are the 18 imperial tribute tea bushes. And ever since then, West Lake Dragonwell, especially Shifeng Dragonwell, has just found its place at the top of all the famous Chinese tea lists. All right, and so this history brings us all the way up from the Tang Dynasty, even the Jin Dynasty, the 300s AD, when we see the first tea planting in the Hangzhou area, all the way up to the Qing Dynasty, where it essentially reaches the height of tea in China. The Emperor Qianlong himself loves this tea, sanctifies this tea. It's in that top spot. But what happens next is the fall of the Qing Dynasty, the beginning of the Republican era of China, and then also the beginning of the PRC. And during this time, we see a radical desacralization happening with this tea area and with the tea productions and the temples responsible for making the teas. During this time, if you remember from the last episode, I talked about Shen, who saw the 3 years of natural disasters, the Great Leap Forward, and all of these changes that were happening. What's happening right now is the Chinese government is really pushing production, pushing yield, looking at tea as a means of liberation for the farmers, for the people. And so it no longer becomes the emperor's pet project. It becomes the tea of the people, the working class means to make money, to gain a foothold in the economy of the world, not to be alienated from your own craft, but to be empowered by it. And so with this rhetoric, we see a lot of changes on how the tea is viewed. We get the 5 major regions now. Instead of the associations with the temples of the Hugong Temple and the Lingyun Temple, we see the 4 peaks in the main village. We see the Lion's Peak, the Cloud Summit, we see the Running Tiger, We see the Dragonwell village itself. These are the four main regions. And then we also see the addition of the Meijiawu village, which is a little lower land and encompasses a lot larger of this area. We also see the expansion of tea production in the region, stretching all the way out to Shaoxing, where I was earlier this year. We see the Tianma Mountain becoming very famous for a tea production region. And tea in the area is just being cultivated as much as they can, preserved, and while production is going very well for the tea farmers, there's a lot of changes going on, especially in the 60s. And remember in the last episode, I talked about Shen and his experiences with the changes in the world and the 100 years of bloodshed and war and civil war and stuff like that. In the 60s, we see China continuing this trend of revolution, of rebelling against the thesis in this living dialectic materialism that was directly imported and inherited from Marx. We see the PRC, the People's Republic of China, waging a civil war against its own culture, against its own past. And so I'm going to be very sensitive here when I try and talk about this, because it is essential when you're talking about modern China to talk about the Cultural Revolution and what happened during the early eras of the PRC, because this is the crux of what changed traditional feudal China into modern China. And so you can't understand this without at least having some form of knowledge about the Cultural Revolution. And what I want to do is I want to give you just a real quick glimpse into some of the legacies of the Cultural Revolution that I saw visible in the tea fields in Hangzhou, as well as kind of explaining why the Cultural Revolution came about, the mentality of the people during that time, and kind of the goals that were enacted during it. I mean, this topic could be an entire podcast on itself, so all I'm going to do is just give you a brief outline of it, and we'll probably come back to it time and time again throughout the podcast episodes and whatnot. So the reason it comes to mind is because when I went to the Lingyun Temple, I saw evidence in the Dragonwell area, the scenic area, of a long-lasting memory of the Cultural Revolution. And now that we've mentioned the Lingyun Temple, I really want to tell you a story about when I visited this temple back in, I think it was 2017. And this is one of the most beautiful temples in China that I've been to. I really like the Guoqing Temple on Taishan. This is also in Zhejiang. But these temples have a huge history for Buddhism, for culture, and they're still living temples. And so the Lingyun Temple is an enormous complex and still like a thriving Buddhist cultural hub. When I went there, there were monks everywhere. There were tourists there still, but you could see the monks were going about their daily lives in the temple, just doing their alms, their prayers, and everything. And even the temple had this general feeling of antiquity about it. And one of the most famous features of this temple here in the West Lake area are the stone Buddhas that are carved into the cliffs, carved into the cave walls, these stone statues. And after reading a lot about these manifold statues, I was very eager to go there and see them myself, because it's really one of the wonders of the temple. And so when I get there, I get into these caves and I'm looking at the statues, and something I found here was just very, very fascinating, because I've seen this in other parts of Jiangsu and other parts of China as well. A few of the stone reliefs and the statues of these Buddhas either had their heads completely missing or were smashed into misshapen lumps of stone and quartz. And it's just really it's hard to explain the complex melding of emotions going into a sacred temple, going into like a holy cave, and seeing some of these statues of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of our hearts that are literally defaced. And just the power of seeing these detailed carvings and the brutal destruction, it's really, there's this strange power and presence about it. It almost feels like a haunted house, like a place where something happened and the energy is still lingering. But at the same time, it didn't necessarily feel malign. It was like this unending echo, a reverberation of power, like hitting a gong, and the sound doesn't fade. And now that I'm thinking about it, it reminds me of something that Nietzsche wrote in The Twilight of the Idols. And in one of his iconic little short phrases, let's see, he writes, whether we immoralists do virtue any harm, as little as anarchists do princes. Only since they have been shot at do they sit firmly again on their thrones. Moral, one must shoot at morals. And the idea here is that only by questioning something can you really arrive at the truth of it. And this is the idea of the feeling, the power, the idea of power I was feeling, is that these statues were almost made more powerful by the attempts to destroy them. Because you don't try and destroy something that is worthless. Only because it has power is it worth destroying. And so just the very act of trying to take the power away, they were imbued with yet more power. And this is really fascinating because it also gets back into some other ideas of Nietzsche, where it's, what do you do to arrive at the truth? You try and shatter everything that is untrue. And so what you do is you take the hammer and you strike everything, and only that which cannot be destroyed is true. And so these Buddhist statues, they were defaced, they were beheaded, people tried to destroy them, and yet the temple survived. The idea of the Buddha survived. The pilgrims return. And so they cannot be destroyed. And so there is a level of truth there that goes beyond any mundane attempt at their destruction. And to me, this is kind of one of the great tenets of nihilism, where it's almost like the nihilist actively seeks to destroy, and in destroying finds the truth. And this actually reminds me of something I read in university. There's this very famous, brilliant rabbi in Israel around the turn of the 20th century named Rabbi Kook, who was a bit of a revolutionary and a mystic when it comes to the Jewish thought. And I believe it is in his essay, The Pangs of Cleansing. He talks about what we need to do to cleanse the name of God, the concept of God, because any conception of God soils it, taints it, brings it down to earth. God needs to remain ever beyond our human thinking mind. And this is the very first chapter of the Tao Te Ching. The name that can be named is not the name. This is the idea, like this book, at the very beginning of the Tao Te Ching, it says this book will lead you further away from the truth because its words, its concepts, it is not the truth. And so to paraphrase Rabbi Kook in that essay, he writes something like, the image of God, the name of God, the idea of God has been so far removed from the original origin that it needs to be washed in the waters of atheism in order to be purified. And this is really fascinating because it's very similar to the nihilistic principle, where what you're doing is, over time, something that was sacred has been adorned with so many ideas, terminologies, theories, and doctrines, and it's like a window pane that's getting covered and covered and covered and covered in dust. And so what we need to do is we need to clean the dust, take the sponge of nihilism, take the rag of atheism, and wipe it clean and see the truth for itself. And for Nietzsche, very similar to a lot of the Taoists and the Zen Buddhists, this truth that's beyond all truths is the natural world, is the world beyond the conception of the world. And the way I see it, to find truth, there are kind of two main methods, the yang and the yin. This is the yin and yang, right? So the yin receives everything and sees what sticks and sees what is true and doesn't refute anything, just lets everything come to it. And this is the idea of the ocean. I think it's the Tao Te Ching, chapter 66. How is the ocean mother of the 10,000 rivers? Because she lays below them and receives all of the rivers. And so she is the master and the ruler. And this is the idea of yin, where you receive everything and you discern the truth for yourself. The yang way is you go out into the world and you destroy. You try and destroy everything, and only that which cannot be destroyed is what is true. And so when I'm sitting in these caves, standing in these caves, looking up these massive headless Buddhas, I realize this is a seat of truth. This is something that cannot be destroyed. This is the face, or, sorry, forgive the pun, the faceless face of power. This is the name that cannot be named. This is what goes beyond all of our human attempts at articulation. And so getting back to the earth, questions are, why? Why were these Buddhas destroyed? I read a sign at the temple and it said, the Buddhas, the faces of the Buddhas were destroyed by vandals in the 60s. And I thought, wow, that's a bit of a misrepresentation there. These were not vandals. These were Red Guards. This is the Cultural Revolution. This is when China was waging war against its own culture, its own history. And this is, I want to be very sensitive here because it's very easy to pass judgment on these things from the outside. And so my undergraduate in university was Chinese languages and cultures, and I studied Chinese history, Chinese poetry, Chinese culture and languages for 4 or 5 years in university. And then I moved to China and lived in the modern living culture of China for the past 6, 7 years. And so even so, I'm very sensitive about passing judgment on these things, and yet I will share with you kind of my thoughts on it. In the last episode, I gave a little introduction on the modern history of China, going back to the mid-1800s. These are the Opium Wars. Talked about the rebellions, the fall of the Jin Dynasty. Oh, the Boxer Rebellion was really fascinating because that was directly against Western influence. The Opium Wars were Western influence. We have the Sino-Japanese Wars. We have World War II. And we see a lot of this, it almost, in the cultural psychology of the Chinese mind at that time, the Western world is encroaching, and China is living in this, the height of their traditional culture. They've just been riding on this, and they're realizing the rest of the world has moved almost beyond them. And so they're feeling this urge to catch up, this sense of need to modernize. And the Cultural Revolution is this catalyst towards modernization. This is the old gods are dead. They're not working for us anymore. We need to destroy them and find our new gods. And this is the idea that the old system is broken. The Qing dynasty has fallen. Our old imperial system is not working. We need to get into the modern world. And one thing about China is it has a huge, thousands and thousands of years of unbroken cultural lineage. And so there's so much stuff in the Chinese mentality, the Chinese unconscious, these superstitions that are really difficult to get rid of. And living in China right now, I still see it. People are like, how do you get a cold? You get a cold because the weather's cold outside. You get a cold because you went to bed with your hair wet. And it's like, no, you get colds from germs. You get colds from viruses. You don't drink cold water because that can give you diarrhea. Cold water can make your internal organs suffer, and that's why it's really, really dangerous to drink cold water. And while there are some seeds of truth in that, it's not necessarily scientific. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to get into the scientific worldview, but you have this deep pull of traditional culture. And so in my perspective, what's kind of happening during this time of the cultural era, the Cultural Revolution and everything, they're trying to drastically alter the course. This is pure dialectic materialism, straight from Marx. This is, you don't like the thesis, so you create the antithesis. And the goal is not the antithesis, the goal is a new synthesis. And so the Cultural Revolution was an antithesis to the current thesis of a very traditional culture. And what you're doing is that you're smashing it with something totally alien, totally against it. And then the result is, this modern China that still has a lot of superstition, but is not hobbled by its traditional understanding of the world. To use another metaphor that's similar to the dialectics is the idea of steering a big ship. You kind of have to overcorrect, and it takes a lot of time to change the course. You have to really, really spin the wheel very, very far before you see any noticeable changes. Now, to be clear, I'm not trying to make this political in any way. It's just my understanding on a different way to view what was happening during the Cultural Revolution, and to not just pass immediate condemnations upon it, but kind of understand the reasoning behind it. I'm not trying to say it was good. I'm not trying to say it was bad. I'm just trying to give a deeper insight into essentially why it happened. And since I mentioned the story of these Buddha statues being smashed by vandals, by people in the Cultural Revolution, I thought it fair to give you a deeper understanding of the Cultural Revolution so that you didn't immediately jump to conclusions about it without really understanding the sheer complexity of it. Because let's face it, who can really pass judgment on it other than the people who lived through it, other than the people who were affected by it, both past and present and future? As Westerners, it's very easy to look in and pass these really quick judgments on something that hasn't affected us, won't affect us, did not affect us or anyone we know. And so, again, just an idea of peering deeper into the psychology of the time and the place and the people that are kind of behind all of this that make up modern China, and getting back these tea regions. So that essentially brings us into the modern era, the modern world of tea production in the West Lake region. I mentioned earlier the 4 peaks, the Lion's Peak, Dragonwell, Running Tiger, Cloud Air, and then also the Meijiawu village. I'll get into these specific regions a little more in the next episode when I get into actually going out there. Next week I'm going to Suzhou, I'm going to the Xishandao, I'm going to Dongting with my tea master next week, starting Monday, so in a few days from now. And then I'll also go to the West Lake area. We have a hotel booked, or a hostel, homestay, something like that, booked in the Manjuelong region, which is, I believe, very close to the Dragonwell village and the Lian temple. And what's really cool about this modern area is it's set up for ecotourism. It's set up for really beautiful hostels in the mountains amidst the tea fields. You can wake up early and hike through the misty slopes of all the terraced tea fields, and especially if you go during this time, you can see people picking. There's this really, in Chinese you would say it's a renao vibe, like the very active, bubbling vibe of a lot of energy going on. So I'm very excited to get out there. And so next episode, I will talk about the different production regions within the West Lake area. I'll talk about how much tea gets made in Zhejiang and in China, how much Dragonwell tea gets made in China every year, how much of that comes from the Dragonwell area, the West Lake area, and then how much comes from, specific places like Lion's Peak. I'll mention some of the spring water out there, and I hope to be able to get into the production methodology for this Dragonwell green tea. I'm still overdue on a Bilo Chun production episode, so I will also talk about how some of these wok-made teas from Zhejiang and Jiangsu are made from start to finish, the processing, the amount of labor, and all that. So thanks for listening to this very historical episode of Tea Soup. And hopefully next time I'll get a little more personal, tell a little more stories about my history here in China and traveling to all these beautiful, beautiful tea production regions. So until then, this is Derek from One River Tea, and I'll see you guys next time. Brew happy.